So thank you, Chris, thank you, Fred, for hosting this. I think my role today, because Chris knows my work very well, we've worked together for years. I'm Andrew Winston. I work with companies to help them build a thriving, resilient, sustainable world at its core. And I do a lot of speaking around the world and a lot of hands-on consulting. I think my role today is to provide a little perspective, mainly on the big business world. We've talked a lot, I think, around business in general and small and medium, but just the really big guys who make up an unbelievable portion of the global economy. And to give you some sense of the pressure they're under, why are they considering sustainability or thinking holistically or systemically, the leaders that are, and the strategies that I really recommend and think are needed to build this kind of world. So I'm not going to go into the mega trends. I spend a lot of time with companies dealing with getting them around, their heads around things like demographic shifts and the shift of power from west to east, the urbanization of the planet. Over half the people now live in cities and the ramifications of that, climate change, resource constraints, technology change. All of those I'm going to take as kind of a given that everybody has some view on them or understanding that these are mega trends, these are big pressures. But I want to turn to a stakeholder view of the world and why companies, in addition to just dealing with this new context for business of all these big trends, the direct pressure they're feeling from a few very critical stakeholders, and that is, I owe some to Chris for his view of stakeholders versus shareholders in the business conversation. And one of them obviously is governments. This is not a map of the world, this is actually a map of all the countries that signed the Paris Climate Accord. So if you're not Libya, Uzbekistan, Syria, or Honduras, you came to the table with a plan to cut carbon and cut energy. So this is, I think, unbelievably historic. The agreement itself is not adequate to get us to 2 degrees or less. If everybody did what they said in the agreement, we'd hit 3 or 4 degrees, which is possibly not livable. But that sounds pretty awful. But it is the first time in human history that the representatives of basically every human on the planet agreed to anything. And if you think about that for a minute, it is maybe a sign of some level of consciousness, maybe the threat that comes in movies and books of like the alien. We are starting to recognize the big global threat. So that means, as governments have said we're going to cut carbon and energy, that policies are going to change. And business knows this, and business is taking this very, very seriously. Second is not makeup, but the idea that businesses are pressing each other in a very real way. It comes under the category of supply chain sustainability. And there's many, many examples for years, but one of my favorites recently is a partnership, an unusual surprise partnership of Walmart, the world's largest company and biggest retailer, and Target, one of its main competitors. They brought to the table together in a few meetings that I've been at, under the banner of Personal Care Sustainability Summit. They brought the big personal care and consumer products companies, their big suppliers, the biggest chemical companies in the world, and some of their suppliers, and brought them together and made it very clear that they needed personal care products to be less toxic, to be less packaging, to be smaller footprint, and they wanted innovation. And in fact, both Walmart and Target over the last few years have in effect banned certain chemicals. They have made lists of chemicals like parabens or phthalates or BPA that they say they will no longer accept in the products on their shelves at a certain time. So I refer to this as de facto regulation. We can worry about what the governments want, but actually when your biggest buyers are changing what they want, it changes things even faster. So this is the kind of pressure, and then more generally in supply chain, and this is a vast simplification of very elaborate systems now across most value chains. You have major companies asking their suppliers for data on their footprint, across all dimensions of physical footprint, on labor conditions, and then most importantly perhaps, information and standards for their suppliers. So they call it cascading up the supply chain. This is a ripple. This drives deep change. Second, we're seeing a generational shift. Or third, we start with governments, businesses pressure on themselves, and now generational change. This is the proverbial millennials. I'm guessing that Lincoln and Nora are the only two in the room, and this is typical. I speak for a lot of management teams, big companies, and we're talking about how important millennials are, and then I say how many are in the room, and there's none. So I suggest companies have a bring your millennial to work day, and they each bring someone, find one in the organization and talk about this. So I joke that people look at this picture, and if they're older than 35, somehow it annoys them. The whole idea they're entitled, whatever, but I'm Gen X, And I remember when I was in my 20s, boomers thought I was entitled. Maybe it was just me, but I think it was the generation. And this has been going on since, I think, Socrates thought Plato was a complete pain. And I heard there's a quote today where Socrates said, the young just don't respect their elders. This is always the case. But there is something different about this generation. There is something different about their view of business that's really profound. A global survey of millennials showed that basically all of them agree with the statement that the success of business should be measured in something more than financial performance. That's a deep generational change. And then the one that I think business really needs to be aware of is that over half of this generation have said that they already have ruled out working for a company that doesn't share their values. When I talk to executives and CEOs and say, why do they care about sustainability? This is one of the main things. They are scared of millennials, as employees and as customers. And they should be. This is Sarah Kavanaugh. When she was 15, she started a Change.org petition, asking Coke and Pepsi, very nicely, if they would change their formula. The most heavily protected intellectual property in business history. She said, change it because there's a brominated chemical that's used and can appear in the product. And she wanted it out. Now, these companies knew about it. They were finding alternatives already, but this was the final straw. The New York Times wrote a whole article about her, and this was the final straw. So they changed their formula. Because 80,000 people signed for a petition. So a movement today can happen with just your computer. You don't need to march. It would help to march also, but you can do an awful lot from a distance. And then finally, probably the most surprising stakeholder that is changing business is investors. And I do not want to overstate this. Investors have been the laggards as a force on business, but we're starting to see something change. And I'm going to come back in a few minutes to the pressure on business, especially public companies, to hit their quarterly earnings. But you're starting to see some very mainstream investors, not the socially responsible, not the ones doing this for years and years, but a guy named Larry Fink. How many people know that name? How many people know BlackRock? Yeah. Okay, BlackRock is the largest asset owner in the world. They have over $4 trillion. Every public company, every large public company, they own 2, 3 to 8%. And Larry Fink has put out 2 letters in the last year to all S&P 500 CEOs. The second one was very harshly worded in what he said. There's a quarterly earnings hysteria, which he and his staff have been a part of, like no doubt, but it's contrary to a long-term perspective. And he said environmental, social, and governance issues, like climate change and diversity and board effectiveness, have real impacts, and you need to talk about them in your business. This is a watershed moment for investor pressure on business. It hasn't manifested in much change yet, but I think we'll look back at his letter in 2015 and 2016 as one of the key moments. So, we've been talking a lot over the last couple days about what we all do, what's our role in the world, and this is a picture of my role in the world. I am not the dragon. I think we have these mega challenges like climate, and I'm not the hero. So what am I? I'm the sword. That's my job in the world, is to provide a sword, and that's tools and frameworks and ideas and stories and inspiration to make everybody in business the hero. That's my job, and you guys are already heroes. I don't really mean to do that, but that's what I do when I try to get in front of companies when I'm not doing kind of hands-on consulting, is inspire them. And that's partly why, I know this is a surprise in this room, but I wrote a book. I would do a show of hands of anyone who has not written a book yet, and there's probably a manuscript on your computer right now if you haven't. But this was my third book, The Big Pivot, and it is about the level of change that we need. And the idea is that to deal with the scale of challenges we have, that we need to shift our priorities. That the point of business today in Western economic thought is short-term shareholder value. And there's stuff wrong with every word in that phrase. That we need to flip it. Because what they do now is they get to shared challenges, sustainability challenges, when the hurdle rate, the investment rate looks good, or there's enough pressure from NGOs. They only do it in a reactive way, for the most part. And you're going to hear about some today that are more proactive. But that we need to flip that. So the point of business is solving the world's shared challenges and building a thriving world, and moving backwards from that and saying, how do you do that? Using capitalism and the tools and markets. And I, for one, am not one who thinks capitalism is a problem. I think capitalism is a hammer. If you use a hammer to make a drill hole, you have a problem. If you use it correctly, it's incredibly powerful. So what is the big pivot? There's 10 strategies. I'm going to take about 10 minutes on each one. I have time for that, right? I'm not going to go into all the details. The book is like $18. But I'm going to talk about these three in a minute, so I won't dwell on them now. It's all about vision. This to me is the core. But there's also these other buckets of changing how we value things in business, how we make investment decisions, how we incentivize people, and then partnering in a new way. Really like that example of Walmart and Target, radical collaboration, and even how companies partner with their customers to reduce impacts. All this is pretty new. At its core, this is about resilience, though. It is kind of a more hot word than sustainability in business. It's a little different. It's not the same thing exactly, but I wrote when the book came out, I also wrote a cover story for Harvard Business Review called Resilience in a Hotter World. And the idea was that there's a lot of different kinds of resilience in business, in addition to personal resilience, but this is about business resilience. And one of the most kind of obvious basic ones is reducing costs, reducing your reliance on stuff in your business, so you are less at risk, less volatility in the world. And this is something Nestle's done very proudly. Over a decade, they've taken their production up. Because we should after all this probably have a good debate about growth and what does growth mean. But in a world of rising to 8-9 billion people, there will be more food. There will be more energy. The question is, how do we do that? And Nestle has said, we have produced 60% more while reducing in absolute terms the stuff it took to do that. This is decoupling. We're seeing this in carbon emissions across the 20 biggest countries. California and the US have done it in particular, but most of the major OECD countries have basically done this with carbon over the last decade. It's a success story that most people don't really realize. Of course, the developing world emissions are rising very quickly, and even holding it flat isn't enough. We need to go down. So this is one of the three main principles of the big pivot: decouple, circular, which takes it kind of up a notch, that the world has to be circular. We have to reuse almost every piece of material in the world, and then we have to get to regenerate, which I know is something a lot of you all work on, and a lot of that shows up in things like agriculture. That's where you hear that word probably the most. And this is systems thinking. This is how I connect it. You asked me to tie that to everything I've heard. I can't summarize everything, but to me, systems thinking in business is about saying we are connected. The reason you care about your supply chain or your employees 6 levels up in your supply chain is because we are connected. So let me talk about this vision. I could spend a lot of time on the problem of short-termism. It is the big hurdle for big public companies. They are told they have to perform within a quarter, and they are under unbelievable pressure. And so I do have sympathy for executives. They're not stupid, they're not cold-hearted, they do get some of these massive challenges, but they have to answer to shareholders. There's a lot of possible answers to this. One of them you heard about earlier today is, and I'll come to that in a second, but actually something that occurred to me over the last couple of days that I haven't really thought about with this before is that short-termism is an incredible level of disconnection from the self. Meaning, if you're taking action that might save you money in the short term, but sacrifices some value to your business later, then you're making the job of the future CEO and CFO harder. What people seem to realize is that future CEO and CFO could be themselves still. And that's what's so strange about the short-term thinking in business, is that people don't do this nearly as much in their own personal lives. CEOs are famously fit. They get up early and they work out and they do all these things that are a pain in the ass right now to make themselves fitter and stronger later. You talk about it in a business context and it gets dicier. So there's this disconnection from future self, and I think we've talked a lot about space-time. I've had a long belief, and this is a total tangent, just for me personally, what this has meant over the last few days is, I went through a very, very dark, hard time when I was in my young adulthood, when I lost someone very close to me. And I remember at the time, over those months of grief and learning about how you handle that kind of grief in life, that there were times that I felt like what was getting me through was not just the people and loved ones around me, but was actually my future self. That I kind of knew deep down that I would someday move on and have a life and have a family, and I could feel it in some way that I could never describe very well to people. And I think the last couple of days has helped me think about that again for the first time in 20 years in a lot of ways. That I'm still in a way speaking back to that person. Most of you have probably done some kind of meditation of forgiveness or something where you go to a previous version of yourself. And I think some of that happens in reality. I don't mean like literally out of body, that you are connected. Anyways, so that was the part of the talk that I don't do for CEOs and others who wouldn't quite get it. But I think there's this disconnection that leads to this kind of problem. One of the solutions is to redefine a corporation. You heard about it earlier, B Corps, to say that the purpose of the business is not just shareholders. I don't actually necessarily think this is necessary per se. I don't think shareholder value isn't the problem. It's how we define value and the short-term problem. If you do everything to make shareholders happy in the long run, you are going to make your stakeholders happy. You have to. But that's a longer conversation. Second, besides the short-termism, how to fight it is goal setting. The other major thing that happened globally last year was the UN passing the Sustainable Development Goals, agreeing as a community, and this is weaving its way into the business community, much more in Europe than in the US, much more. But they're looking at these 17 categories and saying, how does my business tie to these? And I write a lot about, and I've been pushing for a long time, the idea of science-based goals, that goals that have to meet with the constrictions of a finite world. And there are companies, lots of them, way more than people realize. I have a database online called Pivot Goals that has 3,700 goals that are searchable by anybody, free, of the biggest companies in the world. And lots of companies have goals like, we're going to be 100% renewable. That's one of the elements of what a sustainable company needs to look like, one of the main ones. And some companies are already there. Apple makes more energy than it needs pretty much for its data centers. It's starting to get into the energy selling business now. There's companies that are now, and this is where it gets interesting and I think ties to everything we've been talking about, companies now saying, not only are we doing a goal for ourselves, but like Campbell's and General Mills and Kellogg, three very large food companies, they've set goals now for their supply chain emissions, for the farmers that are 1 or 2 or 3 steps up the supply chain, saying you need to reduce your carbon 30% by 2025, something in that range. This is thinking back in the chain. There's companies thinking forward. We heard about BT earlier. They've had this goal for a while of we want our products to reduce energy and carbon by 3 times the amount of our own emissions, using our products for making a more sustainable world. Dell thought that sounded good and made it 10 to 1. That's thinking, again, forward in the value chain. And then the most clearly sustainably minded large company in the world is Unilever. I sit on their advisory board in the US, but I wrote about them long before I was working with them. They have the most robust set of goals, things like we're going to help 1 billion people. That's pretty good, for a single company to say we're going to touch 1 billion people. Hard to measure, but they're doing the best they can. And they have 50 goals along a whole bunch of different areas that tie to the entire value chain, including the women in their, up and down their value chain, including diversity. They're covering so much ground, and there is legitimate belief in this as driving their business. But the third and kind of most important category is the questions we ask of ourselves, what I call heretical innovation. And Chris and I worked together and talked about this for a long time, that we need to ask very challenging questions. Levi's is an example where they recently, after studying how to reduce water use, which we have to do in the apparel industry, every 2 years the apparel industry, just to dye clothing, just to make it colorful, uses as much water as sits in the Mediterranean Sea. It's just every 2 years. That's clearly not sustainable. So they found 10 technologies they think dramatically reduce water use, and then they just put it out, basically, a couple months ago and said everyone can use it. We're trying to change the system here. That's a heretical question. Can we collaborate and share intellectual property to change the system? Totally against the way you're talking business, what you're supposed to do. Then there's companies, I think, asking really deeply heretical things like, are there things we shouldn't even sell? CVS is a $120 billion drugstore chain. They sell everything from pharmacy to food to tobacco until a couple years ago. They said we're not going to sell tobacco anymore. We can't have clinics in the back when we're trying to help people be healthy and sell tobacco. So they asked the question, whether they asked it this way or not, doesn't matter. Should we stop selling things that don't fit our vision of a thriving future? There's companies pushing that boundary even a little further, and the biggest heresy of all, I've written about this for years now, the big heresy is consumption. Can you talk to your own customer about using less of some of your product? Patagonia, the apparel maker, I think most famously a few years ago ran a Christmas ad that said, don't buy this jacket. And they said, our deal with the world is we will make things that last, and you don't buy it if you don't need it. And I've talked to Ivan Shinar, the founder, he means this, absolutely. When people call him and say, I can't, your jacket's too expensive, he says, then maybe you don't need it. I mean, imagine a business owner, that's just unbelievable, really. And they continue to grow. And I'm okay with that, because they sell stuff that lasts a really long time and has basically a lifetime guarantee. And then I just saw this more recently, Mars, which makes a lot of food you could say is not sustainable, but a lot that is, said out loud to people, maybe there's some products you should use of ours a little less. Here's how much maybe you should eat this kind of product. Now these are both privately held, which goes back to the short-term pressure. It's very hard to say something like this if you're public. And then there's an example a lot of us have used a lot of trying to think on the upside, selling a lot more of things that help reduce the footprint of the world. And Kingfisher has a goal. They're the European Home Improvement Center store. that they want to be net positive. They want to help people build buildings that generate more energy than they need. That's being net positive. And there are buildings. This is one in Seattle, the Bullitt Center. There's buildings all over the world now that do this. This is possible. So finally, companies are looking at purpose. We heard about this repeatedly today. And again, Unilever, I think, has gone the furthest in figuring out how do you tie purpose, meaning, some larger issue to a particular brand. And most famously, they use Lifebuoy soap, and mostly in India. And they've been running campaigns to teach people about hand washing skills, because 5 million kids die, 5 million every year before the age of 5, from easily preventable diseases. They think a very simple remedy is to just teach people to wash their hands, and they're using their soap. It is their brand. And that can seem very self-centered, but there's no distinction between does this do good and is it good for our business. It's the same conversation for them. They believe that tying it to purpose is solving a huge problem, and it's good for their business. And it has been good. The 11 brands that they have tied to something larger, like hand washing, are growing twice as fast as the rest of the business, and their stock hit an all-time high recently. It's working. They've been doing this for 6 years. It's working. They are the poster child for this. And so this comes down to something very, very basic, and this is the core of all my work, and I don't think it would surprise anybody here that a business, and all of business, cannot thrive unless people can plan to thrive. And I think to recognize that thriving is to recognize the connection that we all have. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.